Hello and welcome back to Current Conditions. I'm your host, Maggie Hittman. And today, in the third episode of the podcast, I will be talking about the influence of place on personal and collective psychology. So, this is coming on the heels of a discussion of some other contextual factors, namely the qualities of time. In the last episode, we talked about Kali Yuga and basically the dark age of man that we're in, and how that has a noticeable impact on how we operate and how we feel, and how it can be helpful to acknowledge these things. And we also talked about the context related to the collective social sphere and how that also carries its own qualities that we imbibe and influence us, maybe subconsciously, and how that can be an important thing to recognize, even as it relates to health, physical health, and mental health for sure as well. The discussion of context is really a discussion about relationships, how we are relating to different parts of ourselves, but also, like, so far we've really been talking about how we relate to different aspects of our environment. And the biggest thing, I think, is something about bringing into consciousness those relationships is itself palliative, even if we're not able to fix. Obviously, we can't fix the fact that we're in a hundreds of thousands of years long period where there's a gradual darkening. But if we understand that that's there, we can navigate more intelligently inside it. And similarly, if we know that our physical bodies are being taxed because of the collective stress, then we can kind of modify our lifestyle and diet and routines and things like that accordingly. So there's something very powerful about just understanding what the influences are, even if we don't know exactly how to proceed with that information. So with that in mind, I'd like to add another layer to this, which is a little bit more immediate in experientially, and that's the impact of places on our psychology. And this is something I started really looking at about 10 years ago when I did a master's thesis at the University of Utah on a subject I wrote a thesis on a subject called Terrapsychology. And this is a field coined by a man named Craig Chalquist, and I'm actually interviewing him in the next episode. So stay tuned for that. I found a book of his when I was actually working in wilderness therapy, and I read his book whilst sitting beside a delicious, lovely stream in those mountains. And his very straightforward, basic framework that described how the different aspects of place influence us in really specific ways that we don't often recognize on, we could say, an archetypal level. It made a lot of sense to me, considering my personal experience moving from the Midwest to very dramatic mountainous terrain of Utah, which also had its own dramatic cultural shift that came along with it, and how different I felt in those two environments, and how I felt like the environment itself was actually changing me. And I continue to feel that way. So this is a study I've continued. And I also these days approach it from other angles, because there's a way that you can see different environments astrologically as well in the natal chart, and what their influence is likely to be. And also, like, with places that might be beneficial to move, and places that maybe should be avoided. So I do approach it from that angle these days, but there's something about the on-the-ground experience and developing a relationship with place, which has always felt important, but particularly now, I think, feels very important. And it adds another layer of nuance in disentangling ourselves from unconscious influences, which is a discussion we've already begun. And the influences of place may seem mild or just readily apparent and not a big deal, but I believe they actually run very deep. One of the reasons the terrapsychology framework clicked with me so immediately is that I had already become aware of how different I felt in Wisconsin versus Utah. And specifically making this repeated trip to go visit home and come back to Utah, flying usually, how deflated my spirit felt in landing in Wisconsin in the flatlands, and the kind of humid air was so deadening to me, to it felt like some really deep parts of me, that it felt like a light just went out every time I went back to Wisconsin, not just on landing, but my whole time there basically. And then when I would fly back to Salt Lake City and coming into the Wasatch Mountains in this very dramatic mountainous terrain, my whole being just lit up like it was back on, after being turned off in the Midwest. And I really started to connect those different parts of me being kind of like awakened and shut off with the places themselves. And in Utah, especially in that first year, I was really thinking different thoughts. And there was something about the way they came to me in the mountains, the way I started to really, on long hikes and explorations in the wilderness, that the terrain itself was bringing something out of me that was absolutely not available in Wisconsin. It was like if I had stayed in Wisconsin, I would never have been able to fully understand myself, because there was nothing in that place that evoked from me these deeper thoughts and parts of my experience, which eventually I think developed into what I would call my spiritual life, which I also did not exist really in Wisconsin. That was not a part of me that woke up there. And again, I don't think it could have. So when I read the book, that a lot of pieces clicked for me that were already starting to kind of brew, and I was starting to put together. But that gave me a framework to understand in really concrete, approachable ways what exactly was operating on me, and kind of how to maybe approach and proceed in that developing relationship. Ayurveda also does recognize the influence of place. The contention in Ayurveda is that an individual cannot have health without being in a good relationship to the place that they're living, because the qualities of the places that we live are interacting constantly with the qualities in our personal constitution. And that's also why seasonal eating is so important, because the qualities in the external environment are changing constantly. And so we need to respond to that basically, so that the qualities in our system can maintain balance and we can have health. But what terrapsychology brings is more of the subtle psychological, emotional impact of place, as well as the entanglement in the story of place, which I think it can be an extremely powerful thing to wake up to. This has been explored in other fields. There's a field called ecopsychology that definitely understands the importance of the human nature relationship, and other fields along those lines. But the unique thing that terrapsychology brings in is the idea that both parties are conscious, that there is actually a consciousness in different places that's interacting with our own, and the places actually respond to what we're doing. So it's a bi-directional relationship. This is similar to indigenous ideas also of the how humans are related to their places, where it's an actual living relationship, and not just a lot of the Western approach to nature for psychological purposes is about getting the benefit of being outside and the healing aspects of nature. But I believe there's something actually deeper there, where we're actually in interaction in a really meaningful way with the consciousness of a place, which varies by place as well. So that's another thing. And so I'll get into a little bit of my research, my thesis research, so you can get an idea of what this looks like. So I had been living in Utah, I think, for a couple of years at the point that I went back to grad school in a program called Environmental Humanities. that was the brainchild of Terry Tempest Williams, who is a pretty well-known author in Utah and beyond. And so she was one of my teachers, and it was a very creative program attempting to kind of bridge the gap between the sciences and the humanities. So I took up for my thesis project, I took up this idea that I had found in that book that I read, a framework for an actual investigation and research of basically the personality of a place, how you can get at that in specific ways. So I undertook my investigation of Utah because it was where I was living, but it's also a very unique place with a lot of extreme intersecting factors. So there's a lot of different things that I wrote about. But one of the things that I wrote about was actually the air pollution, which is very often in Salt Lake City, the air pollution will be the worst in the nation for long periods of time. So it was something that could not be ignored, and definitely an element of place that was extremely impactful for everyone living there. It was very noticeable when there was bad air quality, and the mood of the whole place would be very dampened, and you kind of could feel like your mind wasn't working very well. This whole shadow came across the place. So I think it was in a particularly bad, what we call inversion, when the air gets trapped in that bowl that Salt Lake City sits in. And so I just started doing some research. And so that's where I actually got onto the etymology, because I just was researching into different words for air in different languages and the etymological roots of those words. And pretty much in every language that I looked at, air had this original root that was associated with something sacred or holy, or there was an idea that there was like a soul that air carried, or there was an actual consciousness or presence inside air. So that was interesting to me. So I started to do some research just into the word air itself and its etymology in different languages and its evolution over time. And it became very clear that in every place that I looked, there was an association of something sacred or holy in the word air itself. A couple examples: the Greek word psyche actually comes from to breathe. The Latin word spiritus, which is the root of spirit and respiration, comes from the word breath or wind. In Sanskrit, we have the word Atman, which is the root of soul. That's what they are generally using to refer to the soul, and that is the root of the word atmosphere. And this goes on. So it's very clear in pretty much every culture I encountered that at one time the air was considered to be a very important, not just empty space, basically actually contained something like spirit or soul in it. So then I was thinking about what it means that to live in a place where what might be one of the most sacred things is the most polluted. So that's when I got into Chinese medicine. I started looking around because they have the association with the organs and emotions. And so I was thinking about air and looking at the lungs, which are the organ of grief in Chinese medicine. And dysfunction in the lungs, generally, my understanding comes from long-term repression or unaddressed grief and sadness. Things like that can imbalance the lungs. So then I was looking at the pictures of the state itself and kind of zooming out. This is something I do in my free time on Google Earth. And I was looking at the Great Salt Lake, which is another very prominent and unique feature of the state, one of the largest saltwater lakes in the world. And I just started to discern the shape of a heart, actually, in the lake. The lake is cut in half by a rail line, and so half of it is very blue and half of it is very pink because of the activity of some brine shrimp on one side. So it actually resembles in its color scheme and its general shape the heart itself. So, and if you zoom out even more, you see that heart is situated inside the Great Basin, which I began to conceive as the lungs inside which the heart is operating. And then that air pollution began to basically represent the dysfunction of the lungs and the repressed grief. Okay. This was many years ago. I can't remember my exact path, but I do remember connecting those themes with a lot of the themes that are present in the state itself, which is the headquarters of the Mormon religion and certainly the center of a lot of long-term repression on various fronts. There's a whole history of that, so a lot to say there. So the idea then is like you're picking up on a story and themes that are inside of a place and seeing how deep it goes. And so I had to connect my own story with that. I moved to Utah just a few months after my dad died, and I was absolutely not digesting my grief and sadness or really dealing with any of that. I was essentially fleeing, I would say, at that time. And so it was very clear that the story of the place was extremely connected to and entangled with my own experience at that time. So it was sort of as if my repressed grief was magnetized by the collective tendency in that area for that type of repression as well. And it's been interesting since then to watch the developments with the Great Salt Lake itself. For a while, it was nearly disappearing. And then this local poet in Utah began to host some events at the Great Salt Lake that was actually writing poems and reading them to the lake itself, which is a perfect example of terrapsychological reciprocation, which is a part of this. Once the theme and the presence of place is understood, making offerings, giving back, that's an enormous subject in astrology as well. Such an important thing to be doing that has mostly fallen out of our culture. But shortly after she started doing that, there was all this rain in Utah, and the lake quickly rebounded. I'm not sure how close to original size, or maybe even beyond, or it's kind of recent. Its original size was Lake Bonneville, so that the Great Basin was basically underwater in deeper history, which is another. Those sorts of things are things you take in the terrapsychological research, the deeper history. But this gives you an idea, I think, what I'm after here, like bringing the story of a place to conscious awareness and understanding how that same story is inside your life. It disentangles you from the pull of some of those themes. So there can be a charge with different places, especially when the themes are unconscious. I think this is a very valuable process to go through. And I actually think that the study is infinite because there's so many different layers of a place. So his framework is looking at geology, different geological features of the place. Like, for example, in my research, the Great Basin itself, that cavity shape that led me to associate it with the lungs. It's also another reason why I think it's actually easy to kind of get stuck in that place because of just the shape of the land, the depression. Geology, ecology, any prominent features of the natural world, the human history, themes that were inside the human history, like what were different cultures focused on, what was their way of life, what were their stories and their mythologies, weather patterns, notable animal life. It's infinite, but those are kind of the backbone of the research. So anyone can do this. And Craig and I will talk more about this next week. But this is definitely a layer I want to bring in because I'd like to return to this and flesh it out a little bit and maybe give people ideas of how they can approach their own places. Just a couple of other examples of themes in terrapsychology. San Francisco, California in general, coastal California being extremely edgy, extreme culturally kind of at the cutting edge of so much, and it occupying a very tumultuous fault line, very energetic fault line, and the edge of the continent right there. So something about that being on the edge, living on the edge is definitely a part of the culture. I think that's undeniable. It's a very kind of like concrete way example of how terrapsychology works. Like you already know, it's just making it more obvious or maybe more methodical. The Bay Area itself is an estuary, and so there's all these different currents converging in that place, making it very fertile territory and very, you can see there's an influx of diversity, which is part of the richness there. And you also definitely see that reflected culturally. There's so much diversity in that place and so many different streams of ideas coming together, mostly productive, but you can see how at times that would create conflict and tension as well, because there's almost just like too much fertility. And I think this is also important now because there is, in the world, there is so much more reactivity and unconscious behavior. And from my perspective, that's largely related to this backlog of unaddressed relationships, be it ancestral or astrological or place-based. And if we're not aware of the way that those places are maybe troubled and maybe radiating out into our personal lives, then it's going to be very difficult to act rationally and consciously and come to any sort of health, again, personally or collectively. So I think there's stories in different places. There's personalities of different places. We get involved in those mostly unconsciously. There's micro stories, and then you can also zoom out and look at an entire state. There's certainly a personality of a state. The borders may be made up and arbitrary, but they do have an impact on what happens inside their scope. And then there's countries themselves. I would like to talk more about the US, especially with the astrology of the US in mind. Each country has its own birth chart, depending on when it was founded. But if we can be aware of these larger stories of places, I think it can help lead us back to kind of like living mythologies and stories that act as guides, because that is, in most indigenous cultures, that's how they navigated, was by stories. And without stories, you can be very lost. And we have a vacancy of myth and story and guiding narratives that are not completely toxic. That's another story. We have stories, but they're not necessarily connected with reality. And the myths are supposed to come from the ground. So this is, again, to me, a crucial layer of proceeding here towards health. So I hope this makes some sense. I hope it's interesting. I would like to expand on it in other episodes and look forward to my talk with the man who invented this framework and who was my mentor for my master's thesis, Craig. And yeah, it's been a pleasure being with you.